The bar was quiet, the kind of quiet that made people uneasy. Conversations were hushed, drinks clinked softly against wooden tables, and in the far corner, a group of off-world mercenaries laughed a little too loudly. They were big, armored, in the latest combat exosuits, their weapons slung casually over their shoulders as if daring someone to start trouble. They had the kind of confidence that came from surviving too many fights, the kind that made them believe they were the deadliest people in the room. They weren't. Near the back, sitting alone at a scratched-up table, was a human. No armor, no visible weapons, nothing about him stood out. He was unremarkable, almost forgettable. His clothes were worn but clean, the kind that blended in anywhere. He sipped his drink, eyes half-lidded, posture relaxed. If you weren't paying attention, you'd overlook him entirely. And that was exactly how he wanted it. The mercenaries didn't notice him. They were too busy boasting about their latest contract, some planetary raid that had gone well for them. They mocked the defenders, laughed about how primitive the resistance had been, how easy it was to crush those who didn't understand real war. One of them, a broad-shouldered brute with a scar running down his cheek, slammed his drink down and turned to the bartender. "What's the toughest thing you've ever seen?" he asked, his voice full of bravado. "What's the most dangerous thing in this sector?" The bartender, an older man who had seen more than he cared to, glanced toward the quiet human in the back. It was only for a fraction of a second, barely noticeable, but it was enough. The mercenary followed the look and snorted. "Him?" He laughed, nudging his companions. "That guy?" The others chuckled, shaking their heads. The human didn't react. He took another sip of his drink, eyes still half-lidded, still ignoring them. That only made the mercenaries bolder. The scarred one pushed back from the bar, standing to his full height. "You hear that, old man? He thinks your toughest thing is a tired-looking human drinking alone." He turned to his crew. "You ever seen a more pathetic excuse for a fighter?" The laughter grew louder. The bartender didn't answer. The human didn't flinch. The mercenary took that as an invitation. He strode across the room, his boots thudding against the wooden floor. He stopped at the human's table, towering over him, a grin tugging at the corner of his mouth. "What's your story, friend?" he asked, his tone mocking. "You some kind of washed-up soldier? Or just another spacer who thinks he's tougher than he is?" The human looked up, finally meeting the mercenary's gaze. His eyes were calm, unreadable. He set his drink down, slow and deliberate. "No story," he said. The mercenary scoffed. "Then why's the bartender looking at you like you're death itself?" The human leaned back slightly, exhaling as if bored. "Because he knows something you don't." The mercenary frowned. "And what's that?" The human's gaze sharpened, just for a second. "That you should have left me alone." For the first time that night, the bar fell completely silent. The mercenary's grin faltered for just a second. Something about the way the human spoke so calm, so certain, made the air feel heavier. But arrogance had always been a dangerous thing, and the scarred brute had too much of it. "Is that so?" he sneered, leaning in closer. "And why's that?" The human didn't answer right away. He just stared, his expression unreadable. His hands remained on the table, fingers relaxed, unmoving. Not clenched in fists, not reaching for a weapon. He didn't need to. The bartender took a careful step back, wiping his hands on a rag that suddenly felt damp. He'd seen this before. Not here, not with these people, but in other places, on other nights, when the wrong kind of fool picked the wrong kind of fight. The mercenary didn't notice. He was too busy trying to push for a reaction. He knocked over the human's drink, the glass rolling across the table before shattering on the floor. A few of his crew chuckled, watching to see what would happen next. Nothing. The human didn't move. The mercenary clicked his tongue. "Guess you're not much for conversation." Still, no response. The laughter from his crew faded slightly, uncertainty creeping in. The room felt different now, like the walls were pressing in, like the air was too thick. It wasn't something they could name, just a feeling, a whisper in the back of the mind that something wasn't right. A smaller mercenary shifted in his seat. "Hey, maybe we should—" The scarred one waved him off. "Relax. He's nothing. He turned back to the human. You're nothing. He reached out, hand closing around the human's shoulder. A firm grip. A challenge. The human sighed. Not in anger. Not in fear. Just tired. Let go, he said, voice still quiet, still even. The scarred mercenary squeezed tighter. And then something changed. It was small. A shift in the human's breathing. A slight adjustment in his posture. The kind of thing that went unnoticed by most, but not by those who had been in real fights. The kind that didn't end with a winner, but with someone who didn't get back up. The bartender took another step back. His hand hovered near the counter, not reaching for a weapon, but for something solid, something to hold on to. One of the other mercenaries, the smallest of the group, felt it too. He swallowed hard, shifting in his seat. Hey, seriously, maybe we should just… A flicker. That was all it was. 1 second, the mercenary's grip was firm. The next, it was gone. His fingers twisted in the wrong direction, his knees buckling before he even understood what happened. A gasp choked out of his throat as he stumbled, hitting the ground hard. No one saw how. The human was still seated, still relaxed. His hands hadn't even moved. For the first time, silence wasn't just in the air, it was suffocating. The mercenaries weren't laughing anymore. The scarred one groaned, rolling onto his back, his face twisted in pain and confusion. What? The human picked up the broken glass from the floor, inspecting it with mild interest. I told you, he said simply, setting it back down. The smallest mercenary was the first to stand. He didn't speak, didn't wait for anyone else. He just backed away toward the door, one slow step at a time. He understood now. He wasn't looking at just another spacer, just another washed-up soldier. He was looking at something else entirely. Something dangerous. Something they should have never noticed. And now, it was too late. The scarred mercenary groaned as he rolled onto his side, his hand clutching his wrist. His fingers wouldn't close properly. He tried to push himself up, but his balance was off, like his body hadn't yet caught up to what had just happened. His crew didn't rush to help him. They were too busy trying to process the fact that he had gone down without a single visible movement from the human still sitting at the table. The bartender kept wiping the same spot on the counter, his knuckles tense. He'd seen fights before. He'd seen brawlers, soldiers, hired muscle, even trained killers. But this was different. This wasn't just skill. It was something deeper. Something worse. The smallest mercenary had made it halfway to the door, but he hesitated, glancing at his crew. If he left now, what would that say? That he was afraid? That he was weak? But wasn't it weaker to stay when his gut told him they'd made a mistake? The human finally moved, shifting just enough to lean forward. It wasn't much, just a subtle shift of weight, but it sent a ripple through the room. Pick him up, the human said. His voice was soft, level, but there was no mistaking it for a request. The biggest of the remaining mercenaries hesitated. He was massive, even for his species, standing nearly twice the human size. He had spent years relying on strength, on brute force that had never failed him. But right now, that didn't feel like enough. Still, he bent down, grabbing the scarred one under the arm and hauling him up. The wounded mercenary hissed in pain but didn't protest. His face was pale, beads of sweat forming at his temples. He knew better than to make another move. The human exhaled slowly, as if thinking, as if deciding. Then, he finally looked at them. Really looked. You shouldn't be here, he said, the words carrying more weight than they should. The biggest mercenary swallowed, his grip tightening on his injured companion. We didn't mean anything by it, he said. Just a little fun. The human's head tilted slightly, as if considering that. Then he stood up. It shouldn't have been a big deal. It was just a man standing from a chair. But somehow, it felt like more than that. The movement was slow, deliberate, controlled. And now that he was standing, the mercenaries could see it. The way he held himself, not stiff, not tense, but balanced. like someone who never had to think about where to place his feet because it was already instinct. The smallest mercenary finally made a decision. He turned and walked out, not looking back. The human watched him go but said nothing. Then he turned to the others. "There's a reason you don't notice people like me," he said, his voice calm. "It's because we don't want to be noticed." He stepped forward, and the remaining mercenaries tensed. "But when you do," he continued, voice barely above a whisper, "it's already too late." The lights flickered, the shadows shifting. And just like that, the entire bar felt colder. The remaining mercenaries didn't dare move. Their leader was still clutching his wrist, his breath shallow, but even he wasn't making a sound anymore. The humans stood there, unmoving, just watching them. No one spoke. The bartender's rag slipped from his fingers and landed on the counter with a soft plop, but even that sound felt too loud. Every instinct screamed that something was coming, something they weren't ready for. The biggest mercenary shifted his weight, his muscles tensing, though whether it was to fight or flee, even he didn't know. His whole life, he had been taught that size and strength made the rules. That people like him, people who could break bones with a single punch, were the ones to fear. But now, fear felt different. The human finally took another step forward. It was slow, purposeful. The kind of movement that made people reconsider every choice that had led them to this moment. "You still don't understand," the human murmured, his voice calm but carrying a weight that pressed against the air. "It's not about fighting." The biggest mercenary clenched his fists. "Then what is it about?" he asked, though his voice came out rougher than intended. The human exhaled like he was disappointed. "It's about knowing," he said simply. And then he moved. Not in a blur. Not in some impossible flash of speed. Just a shift, a change in stance so small, so controlled, that no one saw the danger until it was too late. The big mercenary's breath caught. His body locked up, every muscle frozen. His instincts screamed at him to react, to swing, to grab, to do something. But nothing happened, because the human was already there. Not inches away. Not within arm's reach. Closer. He hadn't heard the steps. Hadn't seen the space between them disappear. But now, the human's hand was resting lightly against his chest. Just fingertips. No force. No pressure. But that wasn't what mattered. What mattered was the fact that the human had chosen to stop. That realization sank in all at once. The big mercenary's mind raced, heart pounding in his ears. If this had been a real fight, if the human had wanted to end it. He swallowed hard. The human's fingers curled slightly, as if considering whether to push forward, whether to end whatever this was. Then, slowly, he lowered his hand and stepped back. The silence stretched, thick and unbreakable. And then, the human spoke again. "You should leave." The biggest mercenary didn't hesitate. He turned, grabbed the injured one by the arm, and started dragging him toward the door. The others followed without a word. They didn't run. Running would have been an admission of what they already knew. They had never stood a chance. The bartender exhaled only after the door shut behind them. He turned to the human, studying him carefully. "What are you?" he asked. The human didn't answer. But outside, past the glass of the bar window, the remaining mercenaries weren't moving down the street. They had stopped, and they weren't alone. The bartender wiped a shaky hand across his forehead, his pulse still racing from what he had just witnessed. He had seen plenty of fights in his time, plenty of mercenaries trying to prove something, but nothing like this. Nothing that left the air feeling heavier, like something deeper had just taken place, something beyond fists and broken bones. The human turned slightly, as if sensing the hesitation still lingering in the bartender's mind. His expression remained unreadable, calm, controlled, just like everything else about him. Outside, the mercenaries hadn't moved. Not because they were regrouping, not because they were plotting revenge, but because something or someone had found them first. A low hum filled the night air, barely audible over the distant city noise. Not mechanical, not artificial. Something alive. The human sighed, rubbing his knuckles absently, as if this was something he had expected all along. They were warned, he murmured, more to himself than to anyone else. The bartender frowned. Warned about what? The human didn't answer. He just walked toward the door. The bartender hesitated before following, curiosity outweighing common sense. When he stepped outside, the cool night air felt sharper, like it had teeth. The mercenaries stood frozen in place, but they weren't looking at the bar anymore. Their attention was locked on the shadows between the streetlights, on the figures emerging from them. Not officers. Not enforcers. Something older. Something worse. The human stepped forward, slow and deliberate. The air shifted again, but this time, it wasn't him causing it. One of the shadowed figures stepped closer, just enough for the dim glow of the street lamps to catch the edge of their features. Their face was smooth, too smooth, like something that had been sculpted rather than born. Their eyes, though, those were sharp, ancient, measuring. The biggest mercenary took a step back, breathing unevenly. This wasn't part of the deal. His voice cracked at the end. The shadowed figure tilted their heads slightly. No, they agreed, their voice unsettlingly even. But you involved yourselves anyway. The human stopped a few feet away, hands still at his sides. They're leaving, he said simply. The figure studied him for a long moment. Then, almost imperceptibly, they nodded. The tension shattered. The mercenaries didn't hesitate this time. They turned and walked away fast, but not running. Running meant they might be chased. The bartender watched them disappear down the street, his stomach still twisted in knots. When he turned back, the shadowed figures were already gone. Only the human remained, standing in the same spot, watching the empty space where they had been. Finally, he turned back toward the bar. You should close early tonight, he said, his voice quiet. The bartender swallowed hard and nodded. Yeah, he muttered. Yeah, I think I will. The human gave him one last glance, then stepped into the night, vanishing as easily as the shadows had. The bartender locked the door behind him. And for the first time in years, he decided not to ask any more questions.